A year earlier, Bitterroot Flats had called Hester Vale the widow who planted death. They said the dark red seed in her field poisoned the land. Some blamed it for failing wells. Others claimed it carried an old curse buried with a forgotten famine. Now those same people stood outside her fence. The line stretched all the way to the wagon road. Men carried empty grain sacks. Mothers stood with hungry children. Thin horses waited behind them with lowered heads. Nobody had come to mock her. They had come to ask for seed. Hester stood quietly on the porch. Beside her sat Brindle, a brown dog with watchful eyes. In her hand rested a small mound of dark red kernels. The cursed seed, at least that was what the valley had called it before drought, hunger, and winter forced them to change their minds. Not one person in that line knew the truth. The seed they feared had never been the danger. It was the reason any of them still had a chance. The story began in the spring of 1879. Bitterroot Flats was little more than a scattering of farms and weather-beaten buildings stretched across a hard piece of Dakota territory. The wind rarely stopped there. It moved through the valley day and night, carrying dust in summer and cold in winter. The land had been plowed bare for too many years. Rain came when it pleased, and almost every family depended on a line of credit written inside a ledger at the general store. At 27, Hester Vale had just buried her husband. Elias Vale rested beneath a small cottonwood east of their cabin, where the ground rose slightly above the prairie grass. A tragic wagon accident had taken him after a wheel gave way on the rough track. What he left behind was not much. A small claim, a half-finished cabin, a shallow well that struggled through dry months, a collection of worn tools, and a debt of $38.70. The debt belonged to Silas Crow, the owner of the general store and the man whose ledger held much of the valley in its grip. 41 days. That was all the time he had given her. If Hester could not prove the claim remained productive, the land would be placed before the territorial board and likely sold for a fraction of its value. One windy afternoon, she stood alone beside the well. She unfolded Silas Crow's notice one more time. She read the number, read the deadline, then folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. She did not cry. The wind did enough mourning for both of them. A week later, Silas Crow showed up in his wagon. His voice sounded friendly, but his eyes didn't. He offered to wipe the debt clean, hand over a little cash, and find Hester's sewing work in town. In exchange, all she had to do was sign away the land. Silas had tried to buy the claim from Elias before, but Elias had refused. Now, he figured a widow would be an easier target. "A woman alone can't hold ground out here," he said. Brindle let out a low growl from under the porch. Hester looked toward the cottonwood in the distance. "My husband is buried here." Silas smiled faintly. "Graves don't pay store debt." Hester said nothing and simply closed the door. For the first time, Silas realized she might be harder to move than the man he had just buried. That night, Hester was searching for a handful of old nails Elias had once hidden away. She was about to check a loose floorboard near the corner of the cabin, but Brindle kept scratching at a different board beside the stove. The dog wouldn't leave the spot alone. Curious, Hester walked over and pried that board up instead. Beneath it lay a small wooden chest wrapped in oilcloth. There was no money inside, no gold, no deed, only several cloth bags filled with dark red seed, a leather-bound notebook, a knotted measuring cord, scraps of rainfall records, and a small bundle of dry soil folded inside a handkerchief. Hester opened the notebook. The handwriting belonged to Elias. Across the first page he had written, "Black Ember Corn." Beneath it, another sentence appeared. "They will call it cursed because they remember the wrong part of the old story." She turned the pages slowly. Depth measurements, rainfall totals, notes about wood ash, straw mulch, notes about beans and squash planted beside the corn. Month after month of careful observation. Elias had not been collecting seed. He had been studying it, and judging by the unfinished pages, he had run out of time before he could prove what he had found. Hester rested her fingers on the worn paper. For a moment, it felt less like reading a notebook and more like holding her husband's hand one last time. The following afternoon, Hester carried a small cloth pouch of the dark red seed to Martha Bell, an elderly widow who had once kept the seed ledger for an old mission station west of the valley. Martha poured a few kernels into her palm and studied them for a long moment. Recognition appeared before surprise. She had seen them before. Many years earlier, one family had planted the same variety during a season remembered for locusts, drought, and a fever that swept through the settlements. By spring, most of that family was gone. The crop became part of the story, and over time people blamed the seed instead of the disaster that surrounded it. Fear had edited the memory. Martha explained that the old farmers had left the soil exposed, planted without beans, failed to hold moisture, and watched the ground die beneath a brutal dry spell. The seed became the scapegoat. Lifting a kernel to her mouth, she tested it lightly with her teeth. Then she nodded. "This seed was never a curse," she said. "It was a hard seed for hard ground." The words settled heavily between them. For the first time since opening Elias's chest, Hester felt something dangerous stirring beneath her grief. Hope, and hope, on the frontier, could be every bit as risky as failure. Back at the cabin, Hester read every remaining page of Elias's notebook by lamplight. The instructions were far more detailed than she expected. Black ember belonged in the center. Pole beans climbed beside it. Squash spread low across the soil. A thin layer of wood ash followed planting. Short-cut straw covered the spaces between rows. Shallow channels guided rainwater instead of letting it run away. Elias had filled page after page with measurements, observations, and corrections. One sentence appeared twice. "Do not plant it like corn. Plant it like a shelter." Near midnight, Hester counted the seed. There was not enough for the entire claim. She studied the land through the cabin window and made her choice. 7 acres lay below the house near the old well. Water lingered there longer after rain, and the soil stayed darker through dry weeks. The next day she carried her embroidered wedding shawl into town. It returned as a used hoe blade, a coil of rope, and several small sacks of bean seed. By the end of the week, planting began. The work moved slowly. Her hands opened the furrows. The seed followed. Then came ash, straw, and careful spacing exactly as Elias had recorded. Under a gray Dakota sky, the dark kernels disappeared into the earth one by one. Brindle trotted along the edge of the field before settling on the windward side where he could watch both the road and the prairie. Travelers passing on wagons slowed when they saw the unusual seed. Some stared. Others whispered. The rumors started before the first row was finished. Meanwhile, Hester kept planting. Each handful of seed carried more than a harvest. With every furrow she covered, another piece of her old life disappeared beneath the soil beside it. The rumors reached every corner of Bitterroot Flats long before anything sprouted from the ground. People talked about the field inside the general store, outside the mill, beside the church steps, and around the community well. Abram Kells, a farmer known for doing things exactly as his father had done them, dismissed the entire idea. According to Abram, a young widow should be growing potatoes or taking sewing work, not digging up seeds connected to old tragedies. Silas Crow encouraged the conversation wherever he found it. Before long, he had given the crop a name, the widow's curse. The phrase stuck. Even those who had never seen the seed began repeating it. A few days later, Reverend Alden Pike visited the claim. The minister spoke gently and carried no threat in his voice. He simply warned that people were frightened. The valley had buried too many hopes already. Another bad omen was the last thing anyone wanted. Hester listened quietly. Then she opened Elias's notebook and turned it toward him. "He measured rain, Reverend, not omens." The answer spread through town almost as quickly as the rumor itself. Unfortunately, it changed very little. To some, her words sounded less like reason and more like grief refusing to let go. Whenever Hester walked through town afterward, conversation softened, then stopped. Brindle stayed close beside her while eyes followed from doorways and storefronts. The farther she moved from the crowd, the more alone she seemed to become. 12 days after planting, the first shoots finally broke through the soil. They looked nothing like ordinary corn. Thin red veins ran through the young leaves, giving them the color of rusted iron after rain. In the early morning light, entire rows seemed touched by a faint crimson glow. Hester knelt beside one of the sprouts. When she pushed her hand beneath the straw cover, the soil felt cool and slightly damp. A few yards away, near the fence line where the ground remained exposed, the dirt was already drying under the spring sun. She took a small wooden probe from her pocket and checked the moisture depth. That evening, another note entered Elias's ledger. The mulched ground was holding moisture nearly 3 days longer than bare soil. The beans were beginning to emerge as well. Tiny shoots reached toward the black ember rows. Squash leaves spread low across the surface, creating shade where the wind could not easily steal water. The field was behaving exactly as Elias had predicted. Unfortunately, the people watching from the wagon road saw something entirely different. They did not see moisture retention, nor companion planting. Only a strange red crop growing on the land of a grieving widow. One afternoon, Nell Harker, a struggling mother raising 2 children, slowed her wagon beside the road. Her youngest stared across the field for several seconds before tugging at her sleeve. "Mama," the child asked softly, "why is her corn bleeding?" Nell had no answer. Neither did anyone else, and that silence allowed fear to keep growing alongside the crop. June arrived drier than anyone expected. Storm clouds appeared on distant horizons, then drifted away before reaching Bitterroot Flats. Week after week, the rain seemed to circle the valley without ever crossing it. Heat settled over the prairie. Wind swept across exposed fields and lifted dust into long brown ribbons that crawled close to the ground. Cracks began opening in Abram Kells's land. Across the settlement, thin wheat struggled to reach knee-height before turning pale. The conversations inside Silas Crow's store changed as quickly as the weather. People stopped talking about profits. They started talking about survival. Meanwhile, flour prices crept upward. Seed grain became harder to buy. Silas reminded customers that careful farmers always survive difficult years. The statement sounded wise enough. What he did not mention was that many of those same farmers already owed him money. On Hester's claim, the drought made itself known as well. Black Ember was not immune. By noon, the leaves drooped under the sun just like every other crop in the valley. Yet something different happened later in the day. As temperatures eased toward evening, the plants recovered faster. The leaves curled less. The soil beneath the spreading squash remained cool to the touch. Water from the last meaningful rains still lingered inside the shallow channels Elias had designed. Rather than celebrating, Hester kept measuring. One evening she dug up a dead plant near the outer edge of the field. Its roots reached 18 inches. A healthier plant from deeper inside the system told a different story. The knotted measuring cord stretched past 31 inches before reaching the end of the root. That number went into the notebook beside the day's weather observations. Nearby, Brindle had dug himself a shallow hollow beneath the squash leaves. The dog slept there through the hottest part of the afternoon. The ground under the shade remained noticeably cooler. For the first time since Elias died, the land seemed to be answering back, quietly, carefully. But in a language Hester understood. By mid-June, the community well had dropped lower than anyone liked. That alone would have been enough to worry people. Fear, however, rarely stops where facts end. Someone suggested Hester's strange crop was pulling water from underground channels. Another claimed the red roots were poisoning the soil beneath neighboring claims. Before long, Nell Harker heard a rumor that if Black Ember reached a water vein, every well in the valley would turn sour. The story made no sense. That did not stop it from spreading. A small meeting was held behind the church. 2 days later, Reverend Alden Pike arrived at Hester's field with Marshal Boone Harker, the local lawman responsible for keeping peace in Bitterroot Flats. Neither man carried an official order. They carried something harder to fight: community pressure. The Reverend cleared his throat and explained that many people wanted the field destroyed before tensions grew worse. Hester listened, then she asked a simple question. Who measured the water? Neither man answered. She asked another. Who dug up the roots? Silence. What about the soil? Again, nothing. Without another word, Hester led them into the field. At the edge of a row, she scooped a handful of earth from beneath the straw cover. A few steps farther, outside the fence, she gathered another handful from exposed ground. The difference was immediate. The protected soil pressed together into a damp clump. The bare dirt slipped through her fingers like dry powder. Boone noticed. The Reverend noticed too. For several seconds, he stared at both hands. The evidence was sitting directly in front of him. So was the fear of an entire community. In the end, only one of those forces left the field with him. The truth remained in Hester's palm. The doubt went back to town. On the third night of the hot winds, Brindle sprang from the porch so suddenly that he knocked over a water bucket. A second later, Hester smelled smoke. She rushed outside. Fire was already moving through a patch of dead grass along the southern edge of the field. Someone had thrown a bundle of dry weeds soaked in lamp grease into the brush. The flames spread fast, too fast. Hester grabbed a bucket and ran, but one glance told her the truth. There was no chance of stopping the entire fire front before it reached the crop. For a brief moment, her stomach turned cold. Everything Elias had left behind seemed seconds away from disappearing. Then the fire reached the barrier. 3 feet of bare earth surrounded the field exactly as Elias had marked in his notebook. The flames slowed. Beyond the strip lay a damp ash trench and rows of squash that shaded the ground beneath them. Fire pushed forward, burned several outer vines, blackened a few leaves, and then began losing strength. The main Black Ember rows remained untouched. By the time Marshal Boone arrived, the danger had mostly passed. Brindle stood near a set of footprints pressed into the dirt, barking furiously toward the darkness. No one admitted responsibility. Nobody was charged. Yet the field survived because of a precaution Elias had planned months before his death. The next morning, Silas dismissed the entire event with a shrug. "If that crop can stop fire," he said, "maybe that proves it ain't natural." Fear had found another story. The truth, meanwhile, was written in a firebreak. The following morning, Martha Bell arrived carrying a short shovel and a glass jar. She asked very few questions. Instead, she walked straight into the field with Hester. One plant was dug from the scorched outer edge. Another came from the healthier center rows. The difference was impossible to ignore. The damaged plant carried shallow roots weakened by heat and dry soil. The second root system stretched downward nearly 46 inches, breaking through compacted layers that stopped many ordinary crops. Nearby bean roots carried small nodules beneath the soil surface. Martha pointed at them, life returning to exhausted ground. Afterward, she filled her glass jar with soil samples. When the dirt settled in water, the field soil held noticeably more organic matter than the powdery earth taken from Abram Kells's property. The old widow studied the jar for a long moment. Then she finally spoke. "It is not stealing water from Bitterroot. It is teaching dead ground how to hold what little heaven gives it." Hester opened Elias's notebook and wrote the sentence in the margin. It was the first real confirmation she had received. Not from a crowd, not from a church, from someone who understood the language of soil. By the end of July, the difference could no longer be ignored. Hester's field was not lush. It was not the greenest land in Bitterroot Flats, but it was alive. While many neighboring crops stood stunted and scorched along the edges, Black Ember remained upright. Squash leaves shaded the ground. Bean vines had begun climbing the stalks exactly as Elias predicted. Silas Crow noticed. More importantly, he understood what it meant. If Hester's seed survived the drought, people would stop depending entirely on the grain stored in his warehouse. A few days later, he returned to the claim. This time there was no pretense of sympathy. He offered to erase every debt, a milk cow, and even promised Hester could remain in the cabin through winter. In exchange, he wanted all the seed, Elias's notebook, and the exclusive right to distribute Black Ember throughout the valley. Hester sat on the porch repairing a grain sack when he made the offer. The needle never stopped moving. "A month ago, you called it a widow's curse," she said. Silas folded his arms. Names change when men learn value. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Hester whistled softly. Brindle rose from beneath the porch and walked to her side. The dog stood between them, watching. "You should leave, Silas," Hester said calmly. "Before he decides whether you're a guest or a thief." Silas turned toward his wagon without another word. For the first time since Elias died, the balance had shifted. He was no longer trying to buy a failing claim. Instead, trying to purchase something he feared losing control of. August ended with 3 days of relentless heat. Then something changed. The sky looked wrong. Not darker, not brighter. The prairie fell unusually quiet. Even the wind seemed uncertain. Brindle sensed it first. The dog paced the field for hours, stopping often to lift his nose toward the horizon. No matter how many times Hester called him back, he refused to leave the crop. That evening, Martha Bell arrived and studied the western sky. After several minutes, she shook her head. "That is not rain." The cold arrived after midnight, fast, merciless. Across Bitterroot Flats, families rushed into their fields carrying blankets, feed sacks, canvas scraps, anything that might protect a harvest. Hester did not have enough material to cover 7 acres. Instead, she followed Elias's notes. Damp grass smoldered in low piles along the windward edge, creating a thin blanket of smoke. Willow branches sealed openings in the shelter rows. The last water from the well flowed into the shallow channels so the ground could release stored warmth through the night. Nobody slept much. By sunrise, the verdict was waiting. Frost coated large sections of the valley. Young wheat lay flattened. Cornfields showed blackened edges. Several gardens looked as though winter had touched them months too early. Hester's field suffered damage as well. A few outer squash vines were gone. Several leaves hung dark and brittle. Yet the Black Ember stalks remained standing. Their color had deepened until some appeared nearly black in the morning light, but the living core remained untouched. Later that morning, Abram Kells stopped his wagon beside the road. He studied the field for a long time. No apology came. No speech followed. The old farmer simply removed his hat before driving away. For the first time, doubt had changed sides. Autumn arrived without celebration. No miracle swept across Bitterroot Flats. No towering harvest transformed Hester's claim into the richest farm in the territory. What emerged from the field was something far more valuable. Proof. From 7 acres, she gathered 37 bushels of usable grain. The squash harvest was modest but healthy. Bean seed filled several storage sacks. Even the dried stalks would provide valuable fodder through winter. When the work was finished, Hester loaded a single-grain sack onto her wagon and drove to the mill operated by Josiah Trent. Word spread quickly. A small crowd gathered. Many expected failure. Others expected poison. Josiah poured a measured amount into the grinding stones and watched carefully. The mill turned. Stone met grain. Dust rose into the sunlight. Then the flour appeared, a warm reddish-brown color. The smell drifting from the collection tray surprised everyone. It carried hints of roasted grain and wood smoke rather than bitterness. Martha Bell borrowed a cast-iron skillet and mixed a small batch beside the mill wall. Nobody spoke much while the cake cooked. When it was ready, Reverend Pike accepted the first piece. He chewed slowly. The room seemed to hold its breath. At last, he swallowed. No sermon followed. No grand declaration, just 4 simple words. It is food. The statement moved through the mill like a church bell. For nearly a year, people had argued about curses, omens, and rumors. Now the answer sat on a skillet, warm enough to eat, real enough to survive on, and that truth carried more weight than every story told against it. Silas Crow understood the danger long before anyone else. If Hester shared the seed, his control over the valley would weaken. One moonless night, 2 hired men slipped toward her storage shed. They expected a simple theft. What they did not know was that Hester had followed another lesson hidden in Elias's notes. Never keep all seed in one place. Some rested in clay jars beneath the cabin floor. Some hung from rafters above the kitchen. Several sacks sat safely at Martha Bell's property. A portion had been mixed with dry ash to discourage insects. Only one large sack remained in the shed. It was bait. Brindle's barking shattered the silence before the thieves reached the road. One man escaped. The other caught his foot in a drying line and crashed into the dirt just as Marshal Boone arrived. The stolen sack contained moldy grain, nothing more. By sunrise, the truth began leaking out. When the ruined seed was opened outside the general store, the captured man admitted he had been paid with flour and forgiveness of an old drinking debt. For the first time, suspicion pointed toward Silas instead of Hester. Unable to steal the seed, Silas turned to the law. A few weeks later, Land Agent Whitcomb Reed arrived to inspect the claim. Silas argued that Hester's planting methods were reckless, superstitious, and unsuitable for productive farmland. Reed showed little interest in opinions. He wanted records, measurements, evidence. Hester was ready. Elias's notebook went onto the table beside her own observations. Martha brought soil samples. Josiah supplied harvest weights and milling records. The knotted root cord appeared next. Finally came sacks of meal produced from Black Ember itself. After reviewing everything, Reed walked the 7-acre field in silence. He examined the fire break, the water channels, the mulch, the stored fodder, the carefully labeled seed jars. When the inspection ended, he opened his ledger and wrote a single note. Claim active, crop viable, soil held. And that was enough. It struck harder than any argument. Across the yard, Silas Crow said nothing at all. For the first time since Elias died, the land had testified on Hester's behalf. Hester had secured her claim, but the valley's true trial was only just beginning. Winter revealed what autumn had hidden. Once the first hard cold settled across Bitterroot Flats, families began counting sacks instead of acres. Many discovered their harvest would not last nearly as long as they had hoped. Feed piles shrank. Flour barrels emptied. Livestock entered the season thinner than usual. At the general store, Silas Crow responded the only way he knew how. Prices climbed, credit tightened. The warehouse doors stayed closed more often than open. People who had laughed at Hester's field now sat at kitchen tables calculating how many weeks remained before hunger arrived. Nell Harker came first. She arrived alone one gray evening, twisting her son's cap between nervous fingers. The woman stood on the porch for several seconds before speaking. Rain had found its way through the roof. Her daughter was sick. The flour bin held enough for perhaps 2 more days. Hester listened quietly. Memories were still there. The rumors, the long months of isolation. Even so, she stepped aside and invited Nell inside. A short time later, the mother left carrying a sack of reddish-brown meal and several strips of dried squash. The arrangement came with conditions. If spring arrived and her family survived, Nell would return twice the seed she received to a community seed chest. No interest, no profit, just responsibility. Word traveled quickly. Abram Kells appeared next. Then other families came. Hester helped each one, but nobody received grain for free. Every household agreed to record planting dates, protect moisture, save seed for vulnerable families, and keep it away from Silas Crow's hands. And it wasn't just the people who benefited. The dried black ember stalks Hester had stored in autumn were divided among the most desperate farmers. Thanks to that fodder, 2 dairy cows and 11 draft horses survived the freezing winter. Brindle often rested beside the doorway while these conversations took place. The old dog seemed especially content when children left carrying food. Outside, winter continued its work. Inside, something unexpected was growing, not a crop. A community learning how to survive together. As winter deepened, the conversations in Bitterroot Flats began to change. People were no longer arguing about whether black ember was cursed. They were asking how to grow it. A small gathering was arranged inside the church one evening. Snow pressed against the windows while lantern light flickered across the wooden walls. Hester sat beside Martha Bell and Josiah Trent near the front. Reverend Pike stood before the room holding a blank ledger. The purpose of the meeting was simple. The seed would not belong to one family. It would belong to a system. Every household receiving black ember would record how much seed they took, where it was planted, how much would be returned after harvest, and what portion would be reserved for widows, elderly residents, and families with children. The Reverend looked across the room before speaking. He admitted that fear had influenced his judgment. No dramatic confession followed. He merely said that the valley had mistaken something for a curse because it carried the color of an old tragedy. That honesty carried more weight than any sermon. Silas Crow objected immediately. According to him, Hester was creating a new form of control. The accusation hung in the room for a moment, then Hester answered, "No one is required to take the seed." The room remained silent. "But if you take the seed, you take the method with it." Several heads nodded. People had finally begun understanding the lesson. The crop alone had never been the secret. Success came down to soil, water, mulch, and discipline. Abram Kells rose from his bench before anyone else. He walked to the ledger, removed his hat, and placed a rough X beside his name. No words were exchanged. Just a single question. How deep? Hester reached into her coat pocket and placed Elias's knotted measuring cord in his hand. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The old farmer studied the cord carefully. That small exchange carried more respect than 100 public apologies. The church that had once echoed with rumors now served a different purpose. It had become a place where survival was recorded, remembered, and passed forward. Spring returned to Bitterroot Flats the following year. The valley had not become rich. Wind still crossed the prairie almost every day. Rain remained unreliable. A promising week could still be followed by a month of disappointment. Nobody who worked the Dakota soil expected mercy from the weather. Yet something had changed. The difference appeared long before harvest. From the ridge above town, a traveler could see narrow water channels winding through fields that had never contained them before. Straw lay between rows where bare dirt once baked beneath the sun. Squash vines crept across the ground. Bean poles stood beside young corn. Along several property lines, strips of cleared earth waited quietly as fire breaks. The land itself looked less exhausted. People noticed, even those who never admitted it aloud. At the church, the seed chest had become as important as the bell tower. Before planting season arrived, families checked its contents the way they once checked weather signs. Martha Bell kept the ledger. Josiah Trent added harvest records every autumn. When arguments surfaced, Reverend Pike usually settled them with the same reminder. A thing should not be judged by its appearance before it has been tested by a season. The lesson had cost the valley nearly a year to learn. Silas Crow still operated the general store. His shelves remained full. His ledger remained active. But no single book now determined who planted and who went without. That change mattered more than most people realized. A community that depended upon one man could be controlled. A community that saved seed together became harder to break. Meanwhile, life on Hester Vale's claim continued much as before. The cabin still creaked during storms. The old well still demanded careful use. Work still began before sunrise. The difference was found in quieter places. The debt had disappeared. The claim remained hers. And inside the storage room stood shelf after shelf of clay jars filled with black ember seed. One afternoon, after the spring planting was finished, Hester walked east toward the cottonwood tree where Elias rested. Brindle followed at his usual distance. Age had begun to slow the dog. White fur showed around his muzzle now, and his joints were stiffer than they had been the previous year. Even so, he refused to stay behind. The grave stood beneath the cottonwood exactly where she had left it. Weathered wood, prairie grass, nothing grand. Hester removed a few kernels from her pocket and placed them beside the marker. Then she remained there for a while, listening. The wind moved through the branches overhead. Beyond the grave, fields stretched across Bitterroot Flats. A year earlier, that same wind would have carried dust. Now it traveled over living ground. Roots held the soil together, plant cover softened the sun, moisture lingered longer after rain. The earth no longer seemed eager to blow away at the first hard gust. Elias had never lived long enough to see any of it. He never watched farmers borrow his methods. Never saw Abram Kells carrying a knotted depth cord in his pocket. Never witnessed mothers feeding children with bread made from the seed people once feared. But the valley saw it. And on the frontier, that was often how vindication arrived. Not through applause, not through monuments, not even through gratitude. A good idea survived because the land itself proved it useful. Nature had rendered its judgment. The rumors were gone. The seed remained.